Hi, my name is Brian Hurtado, and my presentation will be on family sacrifices. Context. For my interview, I decided to sit with my housemate, George James, who resides in South Central Los Angeles. His personal experience narrative originates from the 1960s. George opens up to me and shares a very personal story where his grandfather comes to him man to man and tells him how proud he is of George and all his achievements and that he has great things coming for him. His grandfather sits with George to tell him how and why his life took a sharp turn. This quote is pulled directly from the interview. He told me the story about how he came up and how he was really. My grandfather was like a really great basketball player in high school, and he could have went pro. Like, he's that nice. But he ended up getting my grandmother pregnant, and so he had to, step away from all of that because he had to get a job. He had to start, raising a family and all that. Texture. Throughout the interview, George and I maintained a very personal, comfortable circle. He was able to tell me about his grandfather and how much he means to him. But we got to a point in the interview where George's body language changed. Another quote pulled directly from the interview. There's people who work way harder jobs and get paid way less. And it's something that I always try and grasp. So I always tell it to people when they ask me about why you always keep yourself pushing. I'm like, I'm doing it for my family. They're the ones. George showed discomfort and seemed more closed off as if he was trying to protect himself. There is also a significant change in George's voice and body language. His voice went from very strong and clear to a more dulled tone. His body language went from an open posture to a closed posture and breaking eye contact more often. Context. The interview took place in George's home in South Central, where we sat at his dinner table and he answered all my questions. George learned his form from his grandfather in a moment where his grandfather felt extremely proud of his grandson. This personal experience narrative is generally passed down when something is accomplished or in moments of honor. George also shared with me that he plans to share this moment with his kids in the future, the way his grandfather did with him. Genre. The genre of this story is a personal experience narrative that is very personal to George and his grandfather. George's narrative results from his grandfather's reflections on the experiences of his own life. George's personal experience narrative reflects much of his personality and is the reason behind his character. The narrative is a way of communicating this experience to others to reflect and affirm this self-image. In the reading Personal Narratives and Experimental Meanings by Donald Braid, the listener participates in a direct experience which leads to what Braid calls experiential meaning. He says, a process of engagement with the narrative that results in a narrative experience becoming part of the listener's own resource for living their own lives. At one point, the grandfather told his story to George, the listener. His grandfather's story became his own, and he uses the resources to live his own life. In the reading Feminist Criticism by Lewis Tyson, she says, traditional gender roles cast men as rational, strong, protective, and decisive. They cast women as emotional, irrational, weak, nurturing, and submissive. Throughout the interview, George's mom was brought up a lot, a hardworking woman who provided for George and his siblings while his dad wasn't around. George's mother broke all of these gender stereotypes. In the reading Family Misfortune Stories in American Folklore by Stanley H. Brandeis, he says, given higher intelligence or a different personality endowments, he might have done better. George's grandfather gave up the opportunity to become a pro basketball player in order to provide for his family. If George's grandfather was in a different situation, he might have accepted the offer to become pro. In many family misfortune stories, they result from the conscious rejection of wealth in deference to some higher goal. The most frequently cited goals include either the obligation to a loved one or the maintenance of self-esteem or pride. In this case, George's grandfather gave up the opportunity to become a pro basketball player in order to provide for his family. Lastly, my works cited.